My name is Sabrina Calloway, and I am 28 years old. People say I was born with old eyes. Like I've seen too much of life too soon. Maybe that's true. My childhood was a carousel of broken promises, my teenage years a battlefield of heartbreak, and my 20s. Well, my 20s have been about survival. I rent a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Cleveland, Ohio, where the hum of machines rocks me to sleep at night. I work long shifts at a nursing home, watching the elderly cling to the pieces of their lives that remain, while I try to glue together the pieces of my own. I don't have many people. Not parents worth speaking of. Not a husband anymore. He left with my best friend 2 years ago. But I had Elliot, my cousin, my brother in all but blood. He was supposed to be my family, my safe place, the one person who never let go. For years I believed that. For years I leaned on that truth. Until the night I needed him the most. I can still hear his voice from that night. Sharp, cold, final. "You're on your own, Sabrina. Don't call me again." The line went dead. And so did something inside me. I never thought I could hate Elliot. But hate is a seed. It only needs betrayal to grow. And when it blossoms, it doesn't just take root, it consumes. That was the night I decided. If my cousin could shut me out when I needed him most, then I would shut him out forever. Not quietly, not gently, but in a way he would never forget. The kind of revenge that doesn't scream. The kind that whispers. And tonight it begins. Elliot wasn't just my cousin. He was my shadow when we were kids. He was the boy who stood up to bullies for me on the school bus, the one who sat with me in the cafeteria when no one else wanted to. He'd toss me half his peanut butter sandwich and say, "Family first, Brina. Always." That phrase lived in me like gospel. Through the mess of my parents' constant divorces, through the nights when my mom locked herself in her room and my dad disappeared to God knows where, Elliot was there. He'd sneak me into his house, where Aunt Marlene always had a pot roast in the oven, and I'd sit at their table pretending I belonged. We grew up believing we'd grow old together. Two halves of the same broken family, stronger because we had each other. And in some ways I thought I owed him my life. When my first boyfriend dumped me before prom, Elliot picked me up in his dad's old Ford and blasted Springsteen until I laughed. When I almost dropped out of college, he pushed me to keep going. But that was the Elliot of before. Before money. Before ambition. Before he found reasons to let me sink while he swam. I still remember the exact moment I realized our bond wasn't unbreakable. It wasn't one big explosion, but a slow crack, a hairline fracture that spread. Until finally it shattered. And it happened the night I called him. The night I begged him. The night he chose himself over me. It was raining that night. The kind of Cleveland rain that soaks your bones and makes the city feel like it's crumbling. I was standing outside the nursing home after my shift, staring at my phone like it was the only lifeline I had left. My hands were shaking. My chest felt like it was caving in. My ex-husband, Caleb, had drained the last of our joint account, money I had scraped together for rent and groceries. He left me nothing. Not even an apology. Just an empty account and a voicemail telling me to move on. I didn't care about him anymore. What I cared about was survival. I had $60 in my purse, 3 days until rent was due, and a landlord who threatened eviction if I was late again. My stomach growled, but hunger wasn't the worst part. It was the shame. The shame of needing someone. The shame of knowing who I had to call. Elliot. I dialed his number. Every ring louder than the storm around me. Finally he answered. His voice was clipped, distracted like I had interrupted something more important. I told him everything. My empty account, my eviction notice, how I felt like I was one mistake away from losing everything. My words came out like broken glass, sharp and desperate. I asked for help. Just a loan. Just until my next paycheck. There was silence on the line, long enough for me to hope. Then he said it. 5 words that would change everything. "You're on your own, Sabrina." The line clicked. The storm didn't feel like rain anymore. It felt like knives. The morning after Elliot shut me out, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through his social media, something I rarely did, and there it was. His life, polished and perfect, splashed across the screen like a glossy magazine. Elliot Callaway, the golden boy. A man who married into money, who posted pictures of weekend golf trips and vacations in Cabo, who smiled with teeth so white they looked painted on. His wife, Clarissa, the daughter of a local real estate mogul, posed beside him like a porcelain doll. They had just bought a 5-bedroom house in a gated community outside Cleveland, complete with a home theater and an in-ground pool. And I thought back to his words, "You're on your own." He wasn't on his own. He never had been. He had a wife with a trust fund, a job at his father-in-law's company, friends who toasted champagne at rooftop parties. Meanwhile, I was eating ramen noodles in a cramped apartment where the ceiling leaked when it rained. The cruelest part. He once promised me I'd always have a place in his world. "Family isn't blood, Brina," he told me years ago. "It's loyalty." So when had loyalty become optional? I stared at his smiling face on the screen and felt something new harden inside me. Not just pain. Not just betrayal. Something darker. Something that whispered, if he can erase me so easily, maybe I can erase him too. And in that moment, revenge stopped being an idea. Became a plan. For weeks after that phone call, I lived in silence. I went to work, pushed wheelchairs down fluorescent hallways, spoon-fed soup to trembling lips, and changed sheets for men and women who smelled like medicine and regret. At night, I came home to my leaking ceiling and stared at the cracks, letting anger crawl through me like ivy. I told myself I was done with Elliot, that I wouldn't waste another thought on him. But lies have a taste, bitter and sharp, and I could taste this one every day. Because no matter how hard I tried, his voice echoed in me. "You're on your own, Sabrina." One night I saw him again, this time in person. I was walking home from the corner store with a bag of dollar store groceries when a black Range Rover rolled past. Elliot's car. He didn't see me, but I saw him. He was laughing, his hand resting on the steering wheel like he owned the city, Clarissa's diamond bracelet flashing beside him. They looked untouchable. That was the moment I realized something. People like Elliot only look untouchable until someone like me touches them. And I knew exactly where to start. Because I knew his secrets. And I knew how much he feared them coming to light. People like Elliot were good at pretending. On the outside, he was the perfect husband, the polished executive, the guy everyone envied at Sunday cookouts. But I had seen the other side. I'd seen it long before Clarissa ever came along. Elliot had cracks in his mask. He just worked harder than anyone to cover them. Back in college, I was the one he called at 2 in the morning when he'd lost $500 at a poker table and didn't want Aunt Marlene to know. I was the one who helped him lie to his professors when he skipped classes for underground card games in dingy bars. He swore he'd grow out of it, that it was just for fun. But Elliot didn't grow out of things. He grew better at hiding them. And I knew he hadn't stopped gambling. The way his eyes flickered when someone mentioned casinos, the sudden trips to business conferences in Atlantic City, the credit card statements I once glimpsed on his kitchen counter. They all told the truth. Clarissa didn't know. She thought she married stability. But I knew Elliot. He lived for the rush of risk. And he owed people. Dangerous people. That was the secret I kept tucked in the back of my mind. And now it was the match I planned to light. Because the best kind of revenge isn't loud. It's quiet. It's patient. It waits until the right moment. And I had just decided. His moment was coming. A month after that stormy night, Aunt Marlene hosted a family dinner at her house. She still clung to the tradition, though half the family barely showed anymore. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, and the sound of laughter floated from the dining room. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. I almost didn't go. But Marlene begged me, her voice trembling like she already sensed the distance forming between Elliot and me. "Come, Brina. Please. It'll be good for you." So I went. And that's when I saw him. Elliot, sitting at the head of the table like a king on a throne. Clarissa at his side, flashing her diamond ring as if it were a trophy. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not the warm smile from childhood, but a sharp one like he knew he'd already won. All night he played his part. Charming, successful, untouchable. Then, when dessert came, Aunt Marlene made the mistake of asking Elliot how I was doing. He didn't even look at me when he answered, "Sabrina." He laughed, swirling his wine. "She's always been dramatic. She'll figure her life out someday." Table chuckled. Even Clarissa smirked. My face burned. He had erased me with a single joke, reduced me to a punchline in front of the very woman who once tucked me into bed like her own daughter. That was the moment the last thread snapped. I didn't eat dessert. I didn't stay for coffee. I walked home with fire in my chest and one thought echoing louder than the rest. It was time to make Elliot bleed, without ever touching him. The night after that dinner I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat in my apartment staring at the peeling wallpaper, and for the first time in years I felt calm. Revenge has a way of doing that. It focuses you, sharpens you. I spread everything I knew about Elliot across my kitchen table like puzzle pieces. Old texts, memories, the names of shady friends from college he thought I'd forgotten, places he used to disappear to. A gambling habit wasn't just a weakness. It was a crack in the wall of his perfect life. And all cracks can be widened. I opened a cheap notebook from the dollar store and started writing. Page 1. Elliot's pressure points. I listed everything. His marriage to Clarissa. His position at her father's company. His spotless image in the community. His debt. His pride. Each word on that page was a weapon. I didn't know yet how I would use them. But I knew this much. Revenge wasn't going to be a scream. It was going to be a symphony. A slow, rising piece that would leave him stripped of everything he thought made him untouchable. And the first note of that symphony would be played soon. Because I still remembered a name from Elliot's past. And that name was where I'd start. His name was Vincent Rourke, but everyone in Cleveland called him Vince the Vulture. He wasn't a man you stumbled into. You only met him if you owed money you couldn't pay. And back in college, Elliot had owed him plenty. I knew because I was there the night Elliot begged me to drive him home after losing $2,000 at Vince's underground poker table. His face had been pale, his hands shaking. He swore he'd never play there again. But gamblers never stop. They just learn to hide. I hadn't thought about Vince in years. But when I wrote his name in my notebook, I remembered the way Elliot looked that night. Like a boy about to be eaten alive. That fear was still buried in him, and I planned to dig it back up. It didn't take long to find Vince. Men like him didn't vanish. They lingered in the shadows, waiting for the desperate to come crawling. A quick search led me to a dive bar on the west side, the kind of place where the neon sign flickered and the smell of stale beer clung to your clothes. I stood outside, rain drizzling down, my stomach tight. Walking in meant crossing a line I could never step back from. But Elliot had crossed one first. I pushed the door open. The bar was dark, filled with smoke and whispers. And at the back table, sipping whiskey like a king in exile, sat Vince the Vulture. His eyes found mine before I even reached him. He smirked. "Well, if it isn't little Calloway's cousin." And just like that, the game had begun. Vince didn't stand when I reached his table. He just leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey, studying me like a hawk studies prey. His hair was gray now, but his eyes hadn't changed. Sharp, cold, the kind that made you feel stripped bare. "Well," he said, his grin slow and dangerous, "I never thought I'd see the Calloway girl in my bar. What's the matter?" Cousin Elliot finally run out of excuses. I sat down across from him, forcing my hands not to shake. "Not yet," I said. "But he will." That made him laugh. A low, rasping sound that turned heads at nearby tables. "So the little cousin wants to play. Tell me, sweetheart, what exactly are you offering? And why should I care?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Because Elliot owes you more than money. He owes you humiliation. And I can give you that." Vince's grin faltered just a little. He set his glass down. "Go on." So I told him just enough to hook him. How Elliot had built this shiny life with Clarissa. How he paraded himself as the perfect husband. How he thought his sins were buried. I didn't reveal everything yet. Just the edges. Just enough for Vince to smell blood. By the time I finished, Vince's grin had returned. Bigger. Hungrier. You've got guts, girl. I'll give you that. Alright. You bring me proof that Calloway's still playing games. And I'll make sure his perfect little world comes crashing down. My throat tightened, but I forced a smile. You'll get your proof. When I left the bar, the rain had stopped. But inside me, the storm had only begun. Elliot Calloway's world sparkled like crystal. But crystal is fragile. That's what he didn't see. That's what I planned to show him. On the outside, everything was golden. Elliot sat at Clarissa's long mahogany dining table, sipping a glass of wine that probably cost more than my rent. Their house gleamed. The stainless steel appliances, the white marble countertops, the endless photographs of vacations and charity galas. To anyone else, he looked untouchable. To me, he looked like a man perched on a ledge he didn't even know was crumbling. Another fundraiser next weekend, Clarissa said, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Wear the gray suit, Elliot. It makes you look trustworthy. He laughed, kissing her cheek. Trustworthy is my specialty. I almost choked when I heard that. I wasn't in the room, but I'd seen enough of his life from the shadows to know how he performed, how he smiled for cameras and whispered lies behind closed doors. And now, as he planned speeches for charity events, he was already sliding deeper into the hole he'd been digging for years. Because I knew the truth. Last month, Elliot had spent 3 nights in Atlantic City. He told Clarissa it was a conference. In reality, he lost $12,000 in a single weekend. $12,000 he didn't have. He thought no one knew. But I knew. And soon Vince would know too. Elliot raised his glass in a toast that night. His voice smug and certain. To the Calloway future, he said. If only he knew how short that future really was. Revenge requires patience, but it also requires proof. Vince wouldn't move on whispers alone. He wanted something solid, something he could sink his claws into. And I was going to deliver it. I started small. Elliot wasn't careful with his paper trail. Rich men rarely are. One night, I lingered outside his gated neighborhood, waiting for the security guard to step away. I slipped in behind a delivery truck and parked down the street from his house. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. I knew Elliot's routines. I knew Clarissa always hosted her book club on Thursdays, a gathering of wealthy wives that turned into wine-soaked gossip marathons, which meant Elliot would be alone. From the shadows, I watched his office window glow against the dark. Through the blinds, I saw him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried when he got angry. No, I told you, I'll have it by the end of the month. Just keep the markers off my name, Vince. My pulse quickened. Proof. He was still in deep. The next morning, I followed Clarissa to her boutique gym. While she was inside, I slipped a folded flyer under her windshield wiper. A fake advertisement for a financial advisory service. On the back, I wrote a single message in neat handwriting. Does your husband gamble? Check the bank statements. I didn't need her to believe it right away. Doubt is like poison, it spreads on its own. By the time Clarissa confronted him, Elliot would be sweating. By the time Vince got his proof, Elliot would be cornered. And by the time I was finished, Elliot wouldn't just lose his money. He'd lose everything. 2 days after I slipped the flyer under her windshield, Clarissa posted a photo online. Her and Elliot, smiling over cocktails at a downtown rooftop bar. To anyone scrolling, they looked perfect. But when I zoomed in, I saw it. The stiffness in her smile, the way her body leaned slightly away from him. Doubt had begun its work. I didn't have to guess what happened next. I knew Clarissa. She was the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone when he showered, who noticed receipts in his wallet, who kept folders of household expenses like trophies. A woman like her couldn't resist looking at their bank statements once the idea was in her head. And sure enough, the next week I got confirmation. I was walking home when I saw them in the driveway of their perfect white house. The evening sun slanted across the yard, lighting Clarissa's face. Her voice was sharp, carrying across the cul-de-sac. $12,000, Elliot. 12,000. What conference charges that much? He froze, fumbling for words. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Clarissa's voice only rose. Don't you dare lie to me. Who are you really paying? Elliot caught sight of me then, standing on the sidewalk. For a split second, our eyes locked. He didn't know I'd planted the doubt. He didn't know I was the shadow behind the storm. But I smiled anyway, because that was the moment I knew. Elliot's perfect life had begun to crack. And once cracks appear, glass never holds. Vince didn't trust easily, but he trusted proof. That's why, when I walked back into his smoky bar a week later, I brought him a manila envelope tucked under my arm. My palms were slick with sweat, but my face stayed calm. Revenge isn't about rage. It's about control. He looked up from his table, that same crooked grin spreading across his face. Well, the Callaway girl returns. Tell me you didn't come empty-handed. I slid the envelope across the table. He opened it slowly, like a predator savoring its kill. Inside were copies of Elliot's bank statements, proof of withdrawals in Atlantic City, transactions tied to casinos, and one desperate wire transfer to a private lender I'd traced back to Vince himself. Vince's eyes glinted as he shuffled through the papers. Oh, this is rich, he said. Little Elliot still playing games, still pretending he's untouchable. He chuckled, but the sound was razor-sharp. You've done your homework. I told you, I said, keeping my voice steady. He's still in deep, and if you play this right, he'll fall harder than ever. Vince leaned back, tapping the envelope against the table. And what do you get out of this, sweetheart? Because nobody risks pissing off family for free. I met his eyes. I don't want money. I want Elliot ruined. I want him stripped of everything he thinks makes him better than me. For the first time, Vince didn't grin. He studied me like I wasn't prey anymore, but a partner. Finally, he nodded. All right, we'll play your game. But just remember, once I sink my claws in, there's no pulling out. I didn't flinch. Good. That's exactly what I want. When I walked out of that bar, the night air was sharp, electric. The trap was set. And soon, Elliot would have no way out. Elliot Callaway was used to controlling the board. His whole life, he'd been the golden boy. The cousin who made it out, the son-in-law who married rich, the man who wore tailored suits and shook hands at country clubs. But lately, the pieces weren't moving the way he wanted. The first blow had been Clarissa's discovery of the missing 12,000. She'd screamed, demanded answers, and though Elliot spun excuses about business investments, she didn't buy them. The second blow came quieter, nastier. Phone call. A voice from his past. Vince the Vulture. The man Elliot had promised himself he'd never owe again. And now Vince was calling, casual and cold, reminding him that debts don't die, they grow. Elliot hung up the phone that night. His palms slick with sweat. For the first time in years, he felt something he hated. Fear. The fear grew heavier when shadows began to follow him. First, he thought it was paranoia. The black sedan parked across from his office. The stranger in the leather jacket standing too long near his car. But by the third day, when he found a playing card tucked under his windshield wiper, a joker marked with the word pay up, Elliot knew Vince wasn't bluffing. He'd seen this game before, back in college, when he lost more than just money. Vince didn't send reminders unless he wanted blood. Elliot burned the card, but the image stayed seared in his mind. And what scared him most wasn't Vince. It was how much Clarissa already suspected. She wasn't the kind of woman to forgive secrets, especially when they threatened her pristine world. At dinner that night, Clarissa barely looked at him. She moved her food around her plate, her lips tight, her bracelet clinking against her wine glass. Finally she said, "Tell me the truth, Elliot. Are you gambling again?" Her voice wasn't angry this time. It was colder, sharper. Elliot forced a laugh, shaking his head, insisting it was just work expenses. But Clarissa's eyes cut through him, unblinking. "I married stability," she whispered. "Not a liar." Then she stood, her heels clicking against the hardwood, and left the table. Elliot sat there alone, staring at the roast chicken she hadn't touched, realizing his kingdom was starting to rot from the inside out. And for the first time he didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, Elliot tried to claw back control. He called his father-in-law, hinting at unexpected business costs, and asking for an advance on his next bonus. But the old man didn't bite. "Money doesn't vanish, Elliot. It's either invested or wasted. Which one is it?" Elliot fumbled through excuses, hanging up with his stomach in knots. He checked his bank account. The numbers didn't lie, he was drowning. He thought about selling the Range Rover, but Clarissa would notice. He thought about pulling from her trust fund, but that was locked tighter than a vault. Every option led to exposure. Every move led back to Vince. And Vince wasn't patient. By the end of the week, Elliot found another reminder. This time it wasn't a card, it was a voicemail. No threats, no shouting. Just Vince's voice, smooth as poison. "Tick-tock, Calloway. Time runs fast." Elliot slammed his phone against the desk, chest pounding. He knew Vince well enough to hear the unsaid. If he didn't pay soon, Vince wouldn't just ruin him financially. He'd come for everything else too. And Clarissa was already pulling away. She'd started sleeping in the guest room, citing headaches. But Elliot knew better. She was slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to hold on, the faster she pulled back. What Elliot didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that none of this was coincidence. Vince hadn't resurrected his debt on his own. Clarissa hadn't stumbled into suspicion by chance. It was Sabrina. Quiet, invisible Sabrina. The cousin he'd written off with a single phone call. She was the one feeding Vince his proof, planting seeds of doubt in Clarissa's mind, watching from the sidelines as Elliot's perfect glass kingdom cracked. Every fear Elliot felt, every cold glance from Clarissa, every shadow in his driveway, it was all orchestrated by the person he thought too weak to matter. But weakness is just another word for patience. And Sabrina had waited long enough. That night, Elliot sat alone in his office, the house silent around him. Clarissa hadn't come home from her book club, and the clock ticked past midnight. Elliot stared at the bills piled on his desk, the red letters screaming past due, and he poured himself another glass of scotch. His reflection in the window looked older, harsher. The boy who once promised his cousin loyalty long gone. He told himself he could fix it, that he'd talk Vince down, that Clarissa would forgive him, that everything could still be salvaged. But deep down, Elliot felt it. The walls were closing in. And though he didn't know it yet, the one holding those walls steady was the same cousin he had cast aside. And in the shadows, Sabrina was smiling. Revenge, I learned, is an art form. It isn't about explosions. It's about pressure, applied in just the right places at just the right time until the cracks spread on their own. Watching Elliot these past weeks was like watching a glass of water tremble at the edge of a table. All it took was the tiniest push. From my apartment window, I scrolled through his social media feed at night, comparing the polished smiles to what I had seen with my own eyes. Clarissa's growing distance, the shadows under Elliot's eyes, the forced cheer in his captions. The man who once looked untouchable was unraveling. But I couldn't let the unraveling happen by accident. It had to be me guiding the threads. It had to be me holding the scissors when the final string snapped. Otherwise, it wouldn't feel like justice. It wouldn't feel like enough. The first way to break Elliot was through Clarissa. She was his trophy, his symbol, the proof that he had built something worth envying. And symbols are fragile. I started small. Anonymous messages sent through a cheap burner phone. Nothing dramatic, just whispers. He's lying again. Check the accounts. Ask him about Atlantic City. The kind of things that nudge a wife awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what her husband is doing when he says he's working late. Clarissa didn't know who was sending them, but she didn't need to. Doubt isn't about proof. It's about possibility. And with every new message, possibility turned into paranoia. I watched it in her body language. The way her hand stiffened when Elliot touched her arm at family gatherings. Meanwhile, Vince was tightening his own grip. I gave him just enough information to keep Elliot off balance. A date here, a debt there. I never showed my face when Vince's men circled, but I made sure Elliot knew someone was watching. The beauty of it was simple. Elliot didn't know which fire to put out first. His marriage, his finances, or Vince. And that was the point. A man running in circles never notices who lit the match. Sometimes I felt almost guilty, seeing his shoulders slump, his smile flicker, the nervous glance over his shoulder. But then I'd hear his voice in my head again, cold and sharp from that rainy night. "You're on your own, Sabrina." And the guilt would vanish like smoke. Still, revenge has a cost, and I felt it too. Nights stretched long and lonely in my apartment. My job at the nursing home became mechanical, my smiles for the patients brittle. I had traded healing for hurting, comfort for calculation. Some mornings I stared at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. But I reminded myself, this wasn't about cruelty. This was about balance. Elliot had taken my trust, my love, and shattered them without a second thought. All I was doing was returning the favor, piece by piece. And when the scales finally evened out, maybe then I'd sleep again. The real turning point came one Saturday. I drove past Elliot's house and saw Clarissa in the driveway, suitcase in hand, her face red from crying. Elliot was chasing her, his voice cracking, desperate. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him plead. "It's not what you think. Just give me time." But Clarissa shook her head, climbed into her Mercedes, and drove off without looking back. Elliot stood there in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, but he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Not a king, not even a man. Just a boy who'd finally been left alone in the house of cards he built. My heart pounded, but not from pity, from satisfaction. The trap was closing, and he was finally starting to feel it. That night, I wrote in my notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. At the top I wrote one word: isolation. Elliot's strength had always been in appearances, in people believing in his shine. But now Clarissa was gone. His father-in-law had stopped returning calls, and Vince's men were circling closer. All I had to do was make sure he stayed alone long enough to collapse completely. I listed steps. Feed more rumors into his workplace, remind Clarissa of his debts, keep Vince hungry. Each note was another nail in his coffin. And as I closed the notebook, I felt calm. Revenge wasn't chaos, it was order. And I was finally in control. But even control has shadows. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the boy Elliot used to be. The cousin who shared his sandwiches, who made me laugh when my world was falling apart. I wondered if he was still in there somewhere, buried beneath greed and lies. The thought almost softened me. Almost. But then I remembered the sound of his voice on the phone that night, the words that had broken me in half. "You're on your own." And as the memory burned fresh, I whispered into the darkness, "Not anymore." Then I closed my eyes and dreamed not of forgiveness, but of fire. The conference room smelled of coffee and glass cleaner, the kind of sterile power Elliot used to thrive in. He stood at the head of the long oak table, rehearsed smile plastered on his face. His colleagues seated around him. Today was supposed to be his chance to present a new investment strategy to the partners, a pitch that could have secured his future. But Sabrina's whispers had already done their work. The night before, Clarissa's friend, fed by one of my anonymous messages, had shared news of Elliot's gambling debts with another partner's wife. By morning, the rumors had spread like wildfire through the office. As Elliot clicked his slides forward, he could feel the shift in the room. Whispers, exchanged glances, smirks barely hidden. His voice cracked mid-sentence, and the polished image he had spent years perfecting began to wobble under the fluorescent lights. It didn't take much to finish the job. One of the younger associates, bold with gossip, interrupted him mid-pitch. "Interesting proposal, Elliot," he said with a thin smile. But maybe we should ask Vince about your return rates. A few chuckles rolled around the table. Elliot froze, his fingers tightening around the remote. He forced a laugh, pretending not to understand, but the damage was done. The partners leaned back, crossing their arms, waiting for him to stumble. And stumble he did. His words tangled, his numbers blurred, and the confidence that once commanded rooms like this melted away. By the end of the presentation, the applause was polite, pitiful even. Elliot left the room with his papers trembling in his hands, his face pale. In the restroom mirror, Elliot stared at himself, the suit suddenly feeling too tight, the tie choking him. He splashed water on his face, whispering, "Pull it together. You've survived worse." But had he? His reflection didn't look like a survivor. It looked like a man cornered. The phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, praying it was Clarissa. It wasn't. It was another voicemail from Vince. He didn't play it, he didn't need to. He could already hear Vince's voice in his head, mocking, calm. Elliot gripped the sink until his knuckles whitened, knowing he was running out of places to hide. Meanwhile, I was at the nursing home, folding blankets for one of my patients when my phone buzzed. A message from one of my carefully planted informants. "He tanked. Badly. Everyone knows." I smiled faintly, tucking the phone back into my pocket. My revenge wasn't just about breaking Elliot. It was about making him feel the way I had felt the night he shut me out. Invisible. Worthless. And now, as the office walls closed in on him, I imagined him sitting in his car afterward, hands gripping the wheel, wondering how it had all slipped through his fingers. That image kept me warm all day, even as winter winds howled against the nursing home windows. Elliot's humiliation only deepened when he tried to recover. Later that afternoon, he joined a smaller meeting with a client, hoping to save face. But the client cut him off halfway through the pitch. "Elliot," she said firmly, "I need someone I can trust. And frankly, your name isn't carrying much weight these days." Her words sliced clean, and the silence afterward was deafening. Elliot nodded stiffly, gathering his papers, his cheeks burning. He walked out of the office that evening with the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders, his Range Rover gleaming uselessly in the parking lot. To him, it was no longer a symbol of success. It was just another reminder of the image he could no longer uphold. That night, I parked across the street from his house, engine off, watching through the glowing windows. He sat in the living room alone, a drink in hand, staring at his phone as if it might save him. Clarissa hadn't returned. Vince's men hadn't struck yet. But Elliot was unraveling anyway, undone by whispers, glances, and the slow erosion of respect. I wrote a single line in my notebook. Humiliation achieved. Next, desperation. Because humiliation was only the beginning. Desperation would make him reckless. Recklessness would make him vulnerable. And that was when I'd strike hardest. Revenge wasn't about watching someone fall once. It was about watching them try to get up again, and making sure they couldn't. As I drove away from his quiet house, a strange calm settled over me. I had always imagined revenge would feel fiery, burning hot, consuming. But in truth it felt cold, steady, like ice in my veins. Maybe that was the secret of power. Not passion but patience. And I had more patience than Elliot could ever imagine. Elliot's downfall began with whispers, but desperation made him loud. The night after his humiliation at the firm, he paced his empty living room, a half-empty glass of bourbon sweating in his hand. His phone buzzed with another message from Vince, but he ignored it, scrolling instead to a contact he hadn't dialed in years. Mason, a college buddy who now ran private poker games in the backrooms of downtown bars. Elliot told himself it was just one game, one chance to double what little he had left. A win would buy him breathing room, maybe even win back Clarissa. He needed a victory, any victory, to remind himself he wasn't the joke everyone whispered about. With shaky fingers he sent the text. Mason's reply came instantly. "Buy-in's 20 grand. You in?" Elliot typed yes before he could talk himself out of it. The poker room was thick with smoke and greed. Men in tailored suits and gold watches sat hunched over the table, their laughter sharp and cutting. Elliot took his seat, sliding Mason a check he couldn't afford to bounce. The cards were slick in his hands, the chips heavy, intoxicating. For a few rounds, he almost felt like himself again. The Elliot who commanded respect, the Elliot who could turn odds into fortune. But desperation isn't luck, and luck doesn't stick with the desperate. Hand after hand, the chips drained away, his confidence sinking with them. By midnight, Elliot's tie was loosened, his palms damp, and his 20 grand was gone. When Mason leaned over and whispered, "You want another round? Vince can cover your stake." Elliot's stomach turned to stone. Even here, Vince's shadow loomed. He staggered out into the freezing night air, his heart pounding louder than the city traffic. He had lost everything again. The only thing heavier than the debt was the shame. How far had he fallen that Vince's men were now offering him lifelines? He gripped the railing of the parking garage, staring down at the blur of headlights below. For a moment, he thought about how easy it would be to just let go, to silence all of it, the debts, the whispers, the failure. But then he heard his father's voice in his head, stern and merciless. "A Barrington never quits." Elliot clenched his jaw, pulled himself back, and swore he would find another way. But swearing didn't make money appear. Swearing didn't make respect return. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my car across town, the glow of my notebook filling the dark. I hadn't followed Elliot that night, but Mason had been mine for years. He owed me favors, and when Elliot texted him, Mason let me know. I had orchestrated the whole game, making sure the odds would never be in Elliot's favor. Losing was inevitable. Watching it unfold from a distance gave me a strange satisfaction. Still, when I pictured Elliot in that smoky room, his hands trembling, his pride crumbling, I felt a flicker of something I didn't want to name. Pity. I shoved it away. Pity was weakness. And weakness had no place in revenge. Back at his house, Elliot collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. His once pristine home felt foreign now, the silence suffocating. Without Clarissa's laughter, without the hum of family life, it was just an expensive shell. He thought about calling her, begging again, but what would he say? That he had gambled away their safety net in a smoky backroom. That Vince's men had their claws in him deeper than ever. No, he couldn't. He poured another drink instead, letting the burn drown out the panic clawing at his chest. The man who once strutted through glass towers now sat in his designer home like a prisoner, shackled not by bars but by failure. The next morning, the consequences began to creep in. Mason called, his voice sharp. "That check bounced, Elliot. Vince isn't happy. You'd better figure this out fast." Elliot promised he'd handle it, though he had no idea how. He drove to the office, tried to act composed, but the whispers were louder than ever. A colleague clapped him on the shoulder and muttered, "Rough night, huh?" As if the whole city knew his shame. Elliot locked himself in his office, pulled the blinds, and stared at the pile of overdue bills stacked neatly on his desk. Desperation had pushed him to gamble. Now it was pushing him toward something darker, something irreversible. From my vantage point, everything was unfolding exactly as I planned. Elliot was unraveling not because of one cut, but because of 1,000 tiny slices, each placed with precision. His pride was bleeding out, his marriage gone, his finances destroyed, and Vince closing in. But revenge, I reminded myself, wasn't about speed. It was about savoring the slow crumble. And Elliot was only beginning to taste the bitterness of true desperation. What came next would be worse. Much worse. And I was ready to guide every step of the fall. Elliot sat in his office with the blinds drawn, staring at the blinking light on his phone. Vince had called 3 times that morning, each voicemail colder than the last. By noon, Elliot gave up pretending he could ignore it. He drove across town, weaving through streets that grew rougher with every turn, until he reached a rundown bar on the edge of the industrial district. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and smoke, the kind of place Elliot once would have sneered at. But now it felt like a confessional, and Vince was the priest. The man himself was seated in a corner booth. Dark suit pressed, eyes sharp. "Elliot," he said smoothly as Elliot slid in across from him. "I hear you had a bad night. Lucky for you, I'm in the business of helping men like you. For a price." The conversation was short but heavy, like the roll of dice deciding fate. Vince explained the terms in his calm, deliberate tone. He would cover Elliot's debts, smooth over Mason's anger, and even float him some cash to keep his image intact. In exchange, Elliot would consult on a few investments Vince had in mind. The word was polite, but Elliot knew what it meant. He would launder money, bend the numbers, and risk everything for a criminal he once wouldn't have allowed into his building. For a moment, Elliot wanted to walk away. But then Vince leaned forward, his smile thin. "If you don't, Elliot, I'll have to collect another way. And believe me, you don't want me collecting from your wife." That name, Clarissa, still burned. Elliot's jaw tightened. He shook Vince's hand. Leaving the bar, Elliot felt both relief and disgust churn in his stomach. His debts were temporarily covered, but the cost was higher than money. It was his soul. The streets outside seemed darker, heavier, as if the city itself knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross. In the car, he sat gripping the steering wheel, whispering, "I'll fix this. Just temporary. Just until I'm back on top." But deep down, he knew he was sinking deeper, and Vince had just tied the first stone to his ankles. For the first time in his life, Elliot felt owned, like a pawn on someone else's board. Across town, I sat at my kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee while reading Mason's text. He shook hands with Vince. I exhaled slowly, a mix of satisfaction and anticipation curling inside me. This was exactly what I had wanted. The proud cousin who once left me alone in my darkest night was now entangled with the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to crush him. And the best part, Elliot thought it was his choice. He believed he was clawing his way back when really, he was stepping into a trap I had widened with every rumor, every whisper, every calculated nudge. Revenge wasn't about forcing someone's fall. It was about making them believe they jumped. Meanwhile, Clarissa was beginning to see the cracks from the outside. She hadn't returned home, staying instead at her sister's place in the suburbs. When Elliot called, she ignored him, her stomach tight with dread. She had heard things, snippets from friends, whispers about his debts and behavior. None of it matched the man she thought she married. She sat at her sister's kitchen island, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, wondering how long she could keep pretending. Her phone buzzed with another message from me. Anonymous but gentle. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is walk away before she's dragged under. Clarissa didn't know who was sending them, but she clung to the words like a lifeline. Back in his mansion, Elliot poured himself another drink, staring at the city skyline beyond the glass walls. The house was silent, his reflection fractured in the window pane. He told himself he was still in control, that Vince was just a temporary inconvenience. But as the liquor burned its way down, he couldn't silence the voice whispering the truth. He had sold a piece of himself tonight, and Vince would never stop taking. The man Elliot used to be, the man of power, respect, and control, was slipping away, and in his place stood someone hollow. Elliot raised his glass in a bitter toast to his reflection. To second chances, he muttered, though he no longer believed in them. For me, this was only the beginning. I had mapped out each step, and Elliot had taken another without realizing whose game he was playing. He was no longer my cousin in any meaningful way. He was my project, my lesson in what happens when loyalty is betrayed. Watching him now was like watching a tower crumble, brick by brick, not with a sudden crash, but with the slow inevitability of gravity. And I would be there at every stage, ensuring the collapse was complete. Elliot's phone rang just after dawn, the kind of call that makes your stomach turn before you even answer. Vince's voice came smooth but cold. Time to earn your keep, Elliot. Be downtown by 9. Don't be late. The line went dead before Elliot could respond. He dressed quickly, staring at his reflection in the mirror as he adjusted his tie. He looked like the same man, but inside he felt smaller, weaker. He told himself this was temporary, just one errand. But he couldn't shake the truth. Vince owned him now, and whatever was waiting for him downtown would mark the first of many humiliations. As he drove, the city looked different, less like a kingdom to rule and more like a maze he was trapped inside. His palms were sweaty on the wheel as he rehearsed excuses he knew Vince wouldn't accept. The job was simple on paper. Vince's man handed Elliot a briefcase and told him to deliver it to an address across town. No questions, no delays. Elliot wanted to ask what was inside, but one look at the man's dead eyes shut him up. He tucked the case into the passenger seat and drove, every bump in the road rattling his nerves. With each red light, paranoia crept higher. What if the cops stopped him? What if this was a setup? He imagined headlines. Fallen lawyer arrested in drug bust. His legacy would be ruined forever. He tightened his grip on the wheel, whispering, "It's just a delivery. In and out. You'll be fine." But he didn't believe it. The case seemed heavier by the mile, as though it carried not just contraband but the weight of his dignity. At the address, a nondescript warehouse on the edge of town, two men waited. They didn't speak, just took the case and counted bills from an envelope before nodding him away. Elliot forced a smile, muttering, "Pleasure doing business," but they ignored him. He walked back to his car, cheeks burning with humiliation. Once, men had stood when he entered a room, hanging on his words. Now he was nothing more than a courier, disposable and invisible. The briefcase was gone, but the shame lingered, clinging to him like smoke. When he returned to Vince, the man clapped him on the back. "See, easy money. You do what I say, and your problems disappear." Elliot smiled weakly, but inside, he felt the first chains tighten around his throat. Meanwhile, I was watching the pieces move exactly where I wanted them. Mason had confirmed Elliot's errand before Vince even called him. I didn't need to know what was in that briefcase. It was enough to know Elliot had carried it. Each step deeper into Vince's world was another knot in the rope around his neck. And I wanted him bound tight. I imagined him behind the wheel, sweating, paranoid, terrified of being caught. The Elliot who once called me weak, who turned his back when I begged for help, was now dancing to someone else's tune. And I wasn't just watching. I was conducting, making sure each note played exactly as I wanted. Revenge wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, like a symphony only one person could hear. Clarissa, meanwhile, was living a different reality. She had moved into her sister's guest room. Her things still in boxes, but her decision hardening with each day. She had ignored Elliot's last 5 calls, unable to stomach his excuses. At night, she reread the anonymous messages on her phone, finding strength in words she didn't know came from me. "Walking away isn't weakness, it's survival," the latest one read. Clarissa traced the letters with her finger, tears burning her eyes. For years, she had told herself Elliot was strong enough for both of them. But now she saw the truth. He was drowning, and he would drag her with him if she stayed. She slipped her ring off her finger that night, placed it gently in a drawer and whispered, "I'm done." Back at his mansion, Elliot celebrated his success with another bottle of bourbon, though his hands shook as he poured. He told himself he had survived, that maybe Vince wasn't so bad after all. But the lie cracked every time he replayed the warehouse in his head, the men's cold stares, the way they dismissed him like he was nothing. He had traded his throne for scraps, and he knew it. He tried calling Clarissa again, but her silence screamed louder than words. Alone, he wandered through his empty house, the echo of his footsteps mocking him. He raised his glass in a bitter toast to the shadows. "One job down," he muttered. But deep down, he knew the first job was never the last. For me, the satisfaction was sharp but incomplete. Elliot was still standing, still pretending he had control. But I could see the cracks widening, the fractures growing deeper with every choice he made. His pride had been bruised. His marriage was dissolving. And now his soul was shackled to Vince's empire. And this was only the beginning. The beauty of revenge isn't in the final blow. It's in the slow erosion, the peeling back of every layer until nothing remains but the raw truth. Elliot was on that path now, and I wouldn't let him stray. The man who once left me to fend for myself had no idea that every road he walked now ended where I wanted it to. Elliot called Clarissa again and again until she finally answered. Her voice was flat, stripped of warmth. "Meet me tomorrow, 8 o'clock, at the little Italian place on Birch Avenue." For a moment, Elliot felt relief. Maybe this was it, the chance to repair what was broken. He arrived early, ordering a bottle of their favorite wine, rehearsing apologies in his head. But when Clarissa walked in, her eyes were hard, her steps decisive. She didn't sit close, didn't smile, didn't reach for his hand. "Cut to the chase, Elliot," she said, her voice like glass. He blinked, caught off guard. He tried the old charm, telling her about work, about stress, about how much he loved her. But every word slid off her like rain on stone. Then she pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it between them. His bank statement. Red ink circled his secret withdrawals, the debts, the missing money. "Explain this," she demanded. Elliot stammered, fumbling for lies. "It's business, investments, just temporary setbacks." But Clarissa had already dug too deep. "Don't insult me. I know you're in over your head. Casinos, loans, men you shouldn't be near." Her voice rose enough that other tables turned. "Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I'll go down with you?" Elliot reached across the table, desperate, whispering her name. She pulled her hand back like his touch burned. "I married a man, Elliot. Not a coward who sells himself piece by piece." The waiter arrived with steaming pasta, but neither touched their plates. Clarissa stood, her chair scraping sharply against the tile. She leaned down, her words soft but final. "This was your last chance. I hope the money keeps you warm." Then she slipped the ring from her pocket, placed it on the table, and walked out without looking back. Elliot sat frozen, the ring glinting under the restaurant's dim light. For years, he had built his identity around success, marriage, respectability. Now, with one gesture, Clarissa had stripped it all away. He stared at the empty chair, the untouched food, the bottle of wine sweating between them. His hands trembled, his chest hollow. By the time he stumbled out of the restaurant, the night air felt colder than ever. And in that emptiness, he knew where he would go, back to Vince. Because when the people who love you are gone, the only voices left are the ones that own you. Elliot didn't sleep the night Clarissa left. He sat in the dark, staring at the ring she had tossed onto the restaurant table, still clenched in his fist. The silence of the house was unbearable. No soft hum of her voice, no clinking of her coffee mug in the morning. Only his breathing, shallow and uneven. By dawn, his phone buzzed. "Vince." Elliot hesitated, but he answered. "You're ready for real work," Vince said, his tone smooth as ice. "Meet me at the docks, 10 sharp." Elliot wanted to refuse, to protest, but he had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. Clarissa's voice echoed in his head. "Coward who sells himself piece by piece." He showered, put on a pressed shirt, and drove to the docks, convincing himself this was just business, just another errand. But deep down, he knew something in him was about to snap. The job wasn't a delivery this time. Vince stood with 2 men by a black SUV, smoke curling from his cigar. He gestured toward the back seat, where a young man sat bound and gagged, his eyes wide with panic. "This kid owes me more than he can pay," Vince said casually. "You're going to make sure he understands what happens when people forget their debts." Elliot's stomach dropped. "I'm not," he began, but Vince's eyes cut him down. "You're exactly the kind of man who can do this. Clean, quiet, no cops, no questions." The men shoved a tire iron into Elliot's hands, cold metal pressing against his palms. He froze, staring at the boy's terrified face. He wasn't a lawyer anymore, wasn't a husband. He was a man standing on a cliff, with Vince ready to push. Every instinct screamed to run. But then Vince leaned close, whispering, "Either you handle this, or I tell your little world exactly what you've been doing for me." Elliot's chest heaved, sweat dripping down his back. He walked toward the car, tire iron trembling in his grip. The boy squirmed, muffled cries spilling from behind the gag. Elliot's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. The waves slapping against the dock, Vince's men muttering behind him. He raised the tire iron, his hand shaking violently. For 1 second, he thought of Clarissa, of the life he had once known, of mornings filled with sunlight and laughter. Then he slammed the iron down, not at the boy's head, but at the car's bumper. The sound rang out like thunder. Vince chuckled, stepping forward, taking the iron from Elliot's hands. "Close enough," he said. The boy sobbed, trembling as Vince's men dragged him away. Elliot's legs buckled, but Vince steadied him with a firm pat on the shoulder. "See, you've got it in you." As Elliot stumbled back to his car, nausea twisting his gut, he realized the truth. He had crossed the line. Even if he hadn't struck flesh, he was part of Vince's world now, bound tighter than ever, and there was no undoing it. From the corner booth of a run-down diner across from the docks, I watched Elliot stagger back to his car. His face was pale, sweat slicking his temples. His shoulders slumped like he carried the weight of 1,000 stones. He thought no one saw him, but I did. I'd been watching for weeks, collecting his every mistake like a miser with coins. Tonight I had seen the crack widen. Vince was clever. He knew how to press just hard enough without breaking the toy. And Elliot, oh Elliot, he bent so easily. I sipped my lukewarm coffee, hiding my smile behind the rim of the cup. This wasn't about simple revenge anymore. This was about dismantling him piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. Later that night I drove past the Calloway house. It was dark, silent, hollow, just like him. Clarissa was gone, and the neighborhood already whispered. I slowed down as I passed, remembering the summers of our childhood, when Elliot and I would chase fireflies in that very yard. He used to laugh so freely back then, before arrogance hardened him into someone unrecognizable. That's what made this sweeter. I wasn't just destroying my cousin. I was stripping away the mask he wore for years, showing the world the coward he always was. My phone buzzed, a message from Vince. He did well. He's in deeper now. I stared at the words, my chest tightening with a mixture of triumph and dread. I had wanted Elliot broken. But the closer he crawled to Vince, the more dangerous the game became, for both of us. I parked 2 blocks away and wrote in my journal, as I always did. Tonight, Elliot raised the iron but couldn't swing it. Yet he stayed. That was enough. My pen pressed so hard the letters tore the paper. I closed the notebook, staring out at the empty streets, the hum of streetlights filling the silence. For a flicker of a second, doubt crept in. Was I doing this because of the night he abandoned me in the hospital, when I needed him most? Or because it felt good, too good, to watch him unravel? I shook the thought away. This wasn't about good or evil. This was about balance. Elliot had shut me out when I was broken. Now I was returning the favor, making sure when he called for help, no one would answer. As I drove off into the night, I knew one thing for certain. The next move had to cut deeper. If I wanted him to collapse fully, I would need to bring Clarissa back into play. I found Clarissa at a bookstore downtown, flipping through self-help titles with weary eyes. Divorce clung to her like a heavy cloak, though she wore it with quiet dignity. I approached slowly, pretending it was coincidence, though I had mapped this moment for days. "Clarissa," I said softly. She looked up, surprised, then gave me a cautious smile. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Elliot made sure I was the ghost at family gatherings. I asked if I could sit with her for coffee, and to my relief she agreed. At first we traded polite words, weather, work, small-town gossip. But beneath it all, I saw her pain lingering like smoke. When the moment was right, I leaned in and whispered, "I know what Elliot's been doing. And I know why you left." Her eyes sharpened, suspicion and curiosity mingling. That was the first spark. I didn't flood her with details right away. That would have been too much, too soon. Instead, I let little truths slip through the cracks. "He's been working with men you don't want near your doorstep. He's losing himself piece by piece." I watched her fingers tighten around her coffee cup, her knuckles pale. She didn't ask for proof, not yet, because deep down she already knew. I could see it in the way she exhaled, like someone confirming a suspicion they'd tried to bury. I told her I understood the betrayal she felt. That when someone you trusted most chooses silence, chooses absence, it cuts deeper than any blade. Her eyes glossed over, and for the first time since I sat down, she looked like she might break. That was when I placed my hand over hers, steady but firm. "You don't owe him your silence anymore. If you want the truth, I can show you." Clarissa hesitated, pulling her hand back slowly. Her voice trembled, but her words carried weight. "Why would you help me? You're his family." I let the silence stretch, then answered with a truth laced in venom. "Because blood doesn't mean loyalty. Not when he left me behind when I needed him most." Her gaze held mine, searching for cracks, for lies. She found none, because every word I spoke was sharpened by memory. I left her with a folded slip of paper. My number, a time, a place. "If you want to see who Elliot has become, come find me," I said, standing before she could respond. As I walked away, I could feel her eyes burning into my back. The seed was planted, small but alive. And like all seeds, it would grow. The question wasn't if Clarissa would call me. It was when. The next night, Elliot's phone buzzed again. He had ignored Vince's earlier calls, hoping silence could shield him. But Vince didn't tolerate ghosts. The message was short, sharp. "You're working tonight. Don't make me come find you." Elliot sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, the faint scent of Clarissa's perfume still clinging to the sheets. He thought of running, packing a bag, disappearing into another city. But he knew Vince's reach stretched too far. So, like a man marching toward his own execution, he dressed, slid into his car, and drove to the warehouse by the river. Vince was waiting, leaning against a stack of crates, the glow of his cigar cutting through the dark. "Good," Vince said with a smirk. "You're learning." Elliot's stomach twisted, but he nodded. He didn't know yet what was waiting for him, but he knew it wouldn't be clean. This time the job was heavier. Vince walked him through the warehouse, past stacks of unmarked boxes, until they stopped at a back room. Inside sat a man in his late 50s, dressed in a cheap suit, his face swollen from a beating. He looked up at Elliot with bloodshot eyes, mumbling pleas through cracked lips. Vince clapped Elliot on the shoulder. "This guy's been skimming. He thought he could pocket my money, thought I wouldn't notice. You're going to remind him, and everyone else, that I notice everything." He tossed Elliot a roll of duct tape and a pair of brass knuckles. The weight of them nearly made Elliot drop them. "You don't have to kill him," Vince said with a grin. "But he needs to remember you for the rest of his miserable life." Elliot stared at the tools in his hands, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, to throw them back, but Vince's men circled like vultures. There was no way out. The man in the chair sobbed, begging for mercy. Elliot stepped forward, his knees weak, sweat dripping into his eyes. His mind flashed with memories. Courtrooms where he once defended men like this, Clarissa's face on their wedding day, Sabrina's eyes the last time she looked at him before the hospital. All of it collided inside him, twisting into something raw and ugly. He raised the brass knuckles, his hand shaking. The first strike landed on the man's cheek with a sickening crack. The man howled in pain, and Elliot recoiled, horrified by what he had done. But Vince's voice sliced through the air. "Again!" And Elliot obeyed. Blow after blow, until his knuckles throbbed and the man slumped, half-conscious, blood dripping onto the floor. When it was finally over, Elliot staggered back, chest heaving, hands trembling. Vince smiled like a proud father. "Now you're mine," he said softly. Elliot didn't argue. He couldn't. He knew Vince was right. Clarissa sat at her kitchen table, staring at the slip of paper Sabrina had left her days before. The house was too quiet now. The silence echoed through the empty rooms, louder than Elliot's absence had ever been. She had tried to bury herself in books, in work, in wine, but the words Sabrina spoke in that cafe looped in her head. He's losing himself piece by piece. Deep down, Clarissa had already known. She had seen it in Elliot's eyes long before she left. The shadows, the lies, the way he avoided her gaze. Tonight, the weight of it became too much to bear. She picked up her phone, fingers trembling, and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, then Sabrina's calm voice answered. I wondered how long it would take. Clarissa's throat tightened. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me what he's become." Sabrina agreed, her voice steady, almost tender. The meeting was set. The next evening, Clarissa pulled into a dimly lit parking lot near the river, her hands gripping the steering wheel as though letting go would shatter her. She spotted Sabrina leaning against her car, composed, almost serene, as if she belonged to the night itself. Clarissa stepped out, her knees weak, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Sabrina didn't waste time with pleasantries. She handed Clarissa an envelope, thick with photographs. "I told you he was in deep. Here's proof." Clarissa opened it, her breath catching as images spilled into her hands. Elliot entering warehouses at odd hours, standing beside men with hard eyes. His clothes streaked with shadows and grime. The final photo nearly made her drop the stack. Elliot, standing over a bloodied man, brass knuckles in hand. His face contorted with something monstrous. Clarissa covered her mouth, the sound that escaped her half sob, half scream. "No," she whispered, as if denial could erase the truth inked in those pictures. Sabrina didn't touch her, didn't comfort her. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, as Clarissa's world crumbled in her hands. "You left him because you sensed this," Sabrina said softly. "You knew he wasn't the man you married anymore. Now you see why." Clarissa sank against the car, tears streaking her cheeks, the photos trembling in her lap. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally, her voice cracked and hollow. Sabrina crouched down so their eyes met. "I don't want anything except for you to stop protecting him. He's not a victim, Clarissa. He chose this path. Just like he chose to leave me when I needed him most." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of distant traffic. Then, with a shuddering breath, Clarissa nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "He's already gone." Sabrina's eyes glimmered. Not with joy, not with sorrow, but with something darker. The seed she had planted had grown roots. Elliot couldn't scrub the blood from his skin. He had washed his hands a dozen times, scalding hot water burning his knuckles raw, but no matter how hard he scrubbed, he swore he could still see the red seeping through the cracks. Every time he blinked, the man's swollen face flashed before him, the eyes begging, the teeth breaking under his fist. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. He had done terrible things before, lies in courtrooms, backroom deals, but this was different. This was violence, real, undeniable violence. He sat on the bathroom floor, his shirt clinging with sweat, shaking as if he had been poisoned. And in a way he had. Poisoned by Vince. Poisoned by his own weakness. He thought of Clarissa, of her silence, her absence, and the ache of missing her felt like a punishment. If she could see him now, she'd know the truth. Her husband was gone. The following morning, Elliot forced himself out of the apartment, but the city seemed to pulse against him, every shadow a threat. Vince's men were everywhere, or maybe just in his mind. A black SUV lingered too long at the stoplight. A man on the corner lit a cigarette, eyes fixed on him. Paranoia chewed at his sanity until even the sound of his own footsteps set his nerves on fire. He ducked into a diner, his hands trembling as he ordered coffee, but the hot liquid did nothing to settle him. The waitress gave him a strange look when he nearly flinched at the clatter of dishes. Elliot buried his face in his palms, trying to remind himself he still had control, but the truth was unavoidable. He was owned. Vince's words from the warehouse echoed in his skull. "Now you're mine." And Elliot, broken and bloodied, believed it. That night, he dreamed of the man in the chair. He dreamed of fists pounding, bones cracking, and the smell of iron filling the air. When he jolted awake, drenched in sweat, he stumbled into the bathroom and vomited into the sink. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, gaunt, a stranger. He pressed his forehead to the mirror, whispering to himself, "This isn't me. This isn't me." But deep down, he knew the line had already been crossed. There was no erasing what he had done, no pretending he could climb back into the skin of the man Clarissa once loved. And the cruelest part was knowing that someone, somewhere, was watching, waiting to use his downfall against him. The walls were closing in, and Elliot Calloway had no way out. Clarissa met Sabrina again at the cafe where it had all begun, though this time she didn't hesitate at the door. She walked in with a stiffness that suggested both fear and determination, her jaw set tight. Sabrina was already there, sipping black coffee like she owned the world. "You came," Sabrina said, voice calm, as if she had never doubted it. Clarissa slid into the booth across from her, tossing the envelope of photos onto the table. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face in those pictures." Her voice cracked. Sabrina tilted her head, studying her. "You needed to see him for what he is, not for what you wanted him to be." Clarissa wiped a tear from her cheek, nodding. "So now what? What do we do?" For the first time, Sabrina leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Now we make him feel the same emptiness he gave us." Clarissa stiffened. A part of her recoiled from the word revenge, but another part, the part that remembered the years of lies, the loneliness, the way Elliot chose Vince over her, leaned closer. "What are you suggesting?" she whispered. Sabrina's smile was thin, sharp. "He's unraveling already. I can see it in his eyes every time I pass him on the street. All we need to do is push." Clarissa hesitated, her moral compass wobbling under the weight of betrayal and truth. "I don't want blood," she said firmly. "I don't want to become what he is." Sabrina nodded. "Neither do I. But ruin doesn't always mean blood. Sometimes it's reputation. Sometimes it's stripping a man of everything he clings to until he has nothing left." Clarissa's eyes darkened as she looked down at her wedding ring, still tucked inside her purse. "He left me with nothing," she murmured. "Maybe it's only fair." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them thick but charged with purpose. Clarissa finally lifted her gaze, meeting Sabrina's steady eyes. "If I do this, it's not just for me. It's for him too. He needs to see what he's become." Sabrina's smile softened just slightly, enough to reveal a sliver of humanity beneath the steel. "Then you're ready." Clarissa exhaled slowly, as though she'd been holding her breath for months, maybe years. For the first time since leaving Elliot, she didn't feel helpless. She felt powerful. Sabrina reached across the table, not to hold her hand, but to slide over a small notebook. Inside were names, places, scraps of information she'd collected over the years. "This is where we start," Sabrina said. Clarissa flipped through it, her heart pounding, the weight of her decision sinking in. She wasn't just walking away from Elliot anymore. She was walking toward his end. Clarissa flipped through the pages of Sabrina's notebook as though she were holding a bomb. Each name, each scribbled note represented another thread in Elliot's hidden world. Dealers, loan sharks, lawyers who looked the other way. "How long have you been keeping this?" Clarissa asked, her voice trembling. Sabrina shrugged, though her eyes gleamed with pride. "Years. You learn a lot when you live in the shadows of men like him. Kept records. Always figured one day I'd need them." Clarissa lingered on one page where a name had been underlined twice. A local contractor Elliot had skimmed money from during a pension dispute. He stole from his own workers, she asked in disbelief. Sabrina leaned in. Elliot only cares about power, not people. And the cracks are already showing. You want revenge. You start by widening those cracks. Clarissa closed the notebook with a snap, her breath shaky but resolved. The next week, Sabrina coached her through the first move. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a whisper campaign. Clarissa, dressed in simple jeans and a cardigan, slipped into places Elliot once strutted through in $1,000 suits. The country club, the courthouse cafe, even the grocery store where former neighbors still gathered. She didn't shout or accuse. Instead, she let the truth slip out softly, like a confession shared in confidence. "I don't know what happened to Elliot," she'd say, voice breaking just enough to sound believable. "He's different now. Debts, bad company, gambling." And people listened. They leaned closer, their eyes widening. Rumors spread faster than flames in dry grass, and by the end of the week, Elliot's once untouchable name was being whispered in hallways, in parking lots, in pews at Sunday service. Clarissa felt dirty at first, her chest tightening with guilt. But Sabrina reminded her, "This is just step one. He has to be stripped bare before the real fall." At night, Clarissa sat alone, replaying her words, wondering if she had gone too far. But when Sabrina called to check in, her voice was full of steel. "You did good. He won't see it coming. The beauty of this is he won't know where the storm is coming from." Clarissa gripped the phone tightly, whispering, "And what happens when he finds out it's me?" Sabrina paused, then replied, "By the time he realizes, it'll be too late." The answer both frightened and thrilled her. For years, Elliot had controlled the narrative of her life, gaslighting her, silencing her, making her question her own worth. Now, with each rumor, each whisper, she was reclaiming that power. Still, late at night, when the house was quiet and her reflection stared back at her in the mirror, Clarissa couldn't shake the question clawing at her chest. Was she seeking justice, or was she becoming something darker? Elliot first noticed it at the country club. Men he had once dominated in card games now offered only curt nods, their smiles tight and forced. A woman he had known for 20 years looked past him as if he were invisible. By the time he sat down at the bar, the whispers began. He caught fragments: debts, Vince, gambling problem, words that burned through his pride like acid. Elliot slammed his glass on the counter, demanding answers, but no one dared speak. That silence, that deliberate avoidance, was worse than confrontation. He stormed out, chest pounding, his mind racing with suspicion. Someone had started this, someone who knew his cracks well enough to pry them open. The name that kept circling back like a vulture was Sabrina. She always had a grudge, always circling his orbit like she wanted to drag him down. But then a darker thought struck. Clarissa. Could she? No, he told himself. She was too soft. Or was she? The following days grew unbearable. Everywhere Elliot went, people looked at him differently. At the courthouse, a clerk he'd once bribed refused to take his calls. At the construction site he still oversaw, 2 workers whispered as he passed, shaking their heads. At the grocery store, even the cashier wouldn't meet his eyes. For a man who lived on reputation, it was death by 1,000 cuts. He raged behind closed doors, tearing into his office, slamming phones, smashing a whiskey glass against the wall. Vince's men noticed too. They lingered longer when they came to collect, their stares more pointed, their jokes sharper. "Word is you're losing your touch, Elliot," one of them sneered, and Elliot nearly lunged at him. He didn't sleep at night, pacing the halls of his house, sweating, replaying every conversation he'd had in the last month. Someone was talking, and it was only a matter of time before his enemies had the whole story. One night, alone in his den, Elliot stared at a framed picture of his wedding to Clarissa. Her smile seemed foreign now, almost mocking. He poured himself another drink, hands trembling, and muttered, "It's her. It has to be her." The thought consumed him. Who else could slip so easily into the places he once ruled? Who else knew the right words, the right cracks to split open? The realization was like swallowing glass. Clarissa, the woman he had dismissed, ignored, and betrayed, was finally fighting back. And worse, she might not be fighting alone. Sabrina's name hissed at the edges of his thoughts like smoke. Elliot clenched the photo frame until the glass cracked, blood pricking his palm. "You want war," he growled into the empty room. "You'll get war." For the first time, Elliot wasn't just scared. He was enraged, a cornered animal ready to strike. The problem was, his rage was exactly what Clarissa and Sabrina were counting on. Clarissa sat at Sabrina's kitchen table, the same table where they had first plotted whispers like tiny sparks. Now the sparks had spread into a fire. She could feel Elliot's anger, even from miles away. "He knows," Clarissa whispered, staring at her hands. "He knows it's me." Sabrina leaned back, her expression calm, almost satisfied. "Good. That means we're ahead of schedule. Paranoia makes him sloppy." She slid a folder across the table, full of documents Clarissa didn't recognize at first. Old property deeds, questionable pension accounts, and a trail of kickbacks Elliot had taken through shell companies. This is the next step. Whispers were just the appetizer. Now we serve the main course. Clarissa touched the papers with trembling fingers. If this gets out, it won't just ruin him. It'll bury him. Sabrina's eyes hardened. That's the point. He buried us for years. It's time he knows what it feels like to choke on dirt. That night, Clarissa practiced what Sabrina taught her. Control the story. She began feeding carefully chosen pieces of evidence to the right people. A journalist who owed her a favor from years ago. A retired union leader Elliot had once cheated. Even a pastor who had turned a blind eye when Elliot flaunted his wealth in front of struggling families. Clarissa never revealed herself directly. Her voice was always disguised, her tips anonymous, her proof delivered quietly in envelopes. But each drop was precise, deliberate. By the end of the week, a local paper had begun asking questions about Elliot's financial dealings, and whispers turned into headlines. Elliot's photograph appeared under the words, "pension scandal," and Clarissa nearly dropped her coffee when she saw it. Her stomach twisted between terror and exhilaration. For years, Elliot had been untouchable, shielded by charm and lies. Now, his armor was cracking in public view, and Clarissa knew there was no going back. Sabrina celebrated with a bottle of cheap wine, raising her glass high. "To the fall of kings," she toasted, her laughter sharp and full. Clarissa clinked glasses with her but found herself quieter. Revenge tasted sweet, yes, but there was bitterness underneath. "He's not going to take this lying down," she murmured. "He'll fight back. He'll come for me." Sabrina leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Let him. That's the beauty of it. The harder he fights, the more he exposes himself. He's a man built on appearances, Clarissa. Once those appearances shatter, all that's left is a desperate fool swinging at shadows." Clarissa nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe Sabrina. She wanted to feel safe in the storm they had unleashed. But deep down, she knew Elliot wasn't just any desperate fool. He was family, blood, and cornered family had a way of striking the deepest. The first blow came at the courthouse. Elliot stormed into a public zoning meeting meant to be routine, but instead of business as usual, he erupted. "You think you can slander me?" he bellowed, slamming his fists onto the podium. The room went silent, every set of eyes glued to him. "I've built this town. Every one of you owes me your jobs, your pensions, your lives." His voice cracked with rage. Someone tried to calm him, but he shoved the microphone aside, spit flying as he ranted about betrayal, enemies, and lies. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked. By the time 2 deputies escorted him out, the damage was done. The next morning's paper didn't just question his finances, it printed his outburst word for word, plastered with the headline, "Councilman Unhinged?" Elliot had finally given the whispers a face, and it was the red, furious mask of a man losing control. At home, Clarissa watched the footage replay on television. Her knees went weak as Elliot's rants filled the living room. His face twisted in fury. Neighbors would see it, co-workers, old friends, everyone. She should have felt triumph, but what she felt instead was fear. She knew Elliot. This wasn't a man embarrassed into silence. This was a man cornered, humiliated, and hungry to make someone pay. When she picked up her phone, Sabrina was already calling. "Perfect," Sabrina said, almost gleeful. "He's handing us his destruction on a silver platter." Clarissa's voice shook. "You don't understand. He won't stop here. He'll come home, and when he does, it won't just be words." There was a pause on the other end. Then Sabrina's voice softened slightly. "Then we prepare. Remember, his anger is a weapon we can turn against him. Let him swing. Just make sure when he does, the world is watching." Clarissa didn't have to wait long. That night, Elliot came home smelling of whiskey, his eyes wild. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. "You think I don't know it's you?" he roared, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You and your cousin, the little rat who's been after me for years. You've poisoned everyone against me." Clarissa's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, clutching the edge of the counter. Elliot's face twisted in a snarl, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might strike her. But instead, he smashed a vase against the floor, shards flying. "I'll burn you both down before I let you win," he spat, storming upstairs. Clarissa sank to the floor, her body trembling, but inside her, something shifted. Fear was still there, yes, but beneath it, a spark of resolve burned hotter. If Elliot wanted war, she would give him one. And this time, she would make sure he didn't walk away unscathed. Clarissa couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every shadow looked like Elliot returning to unleash more fury. But somewhere between midnight and dawn, her fear twisted into something else. She had lived for years in his shadow, enduring his arrogance, his infidelities, his cruel dismissals. Tonight had shown her the truth. Elliot wasn't a titan. He wasn't invincible. He was a man unraveling, a bully stripped of his mask. Sitting at the kitchen table, Clarissa whispered to herself, "No more." She opened Sabrina's folder of evidence, her hands steady for the first time. These papers weren't just Sabrina's weapons anymore. They were hers. She realized then that revenge wasn't just about helping Sabrina, or exposing Elliot. It was about reclaiming the years she had lost, the voice she had silenced. By sunrise, Clarissa knew. She wasn't just a pawn in this game. She was ready to be a queen. The next morning, she didn't flinch when Elliot stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. Instead, she poured herself coffee and made a call. "It's me," she told Sabrina. "I'm in. Fully." There was a pause. Then Sabrina's laugh rang through the phone like a battle drum. "I was waiting for this day," she said. Together, they spent hours refining their strategy. Clarissa volunteered information only she would know. Elliot's business associates, his offshore accounts, the skeletons he thought were buried too deep to find. She knew his routines, his passwords, the way he bragged when drunk. Sabrina listened carefully, scribbling notes, her grin growing with each revelation. "You've been sitting on gold," Sabrina said. Clarissa exhaled, a shaky smile forming. "I guess I was too scared to spend it." For the first time in years she felt powerful. Not just protected by Sabrina's boldness, but dangerous in her own right. That evening, Clarissa tested her newfound strength. She reached out to an old friend. Margot, a former accountant Elliot had fired years ago when she questioned his numbers. Clarissa arranged a quiet meeting at a diner off the interstate. When Margot arrived, suspicion flickered in her eyes. But when Clarissa laid down copies of the pension documents, that suspicion melted into fury. "He ruined me," Margot whispered, her knuckles white against her coffee mug. "If you're taking him down, I'll help." Clarissa left that diner with more than just an ally. She left with proof that people were ready to rise against Elliot if given the chance. Driving home, she gripped the steering wheel tight. her reflection staring back at her in the rearview mirror. She didn't see the timid wife anymore. She saw a woman with fire in her veins. Elliot had unleashed his rage, yes. But Clarissa had finally unleashed hers. And unlike hers wasn't reckless. It was controlled, deliberate, unstoppable. The days that followed felt like a storm brewing, silent but heavy in the air. Clarissa moved carefully, pretending at home that nothing had changed, nodding through Elliot's drunken rants and distracted silences. But behind closed doors, she was working with Sabrina night after night. They mapped everything. His bank accounts, his crooked deals, his connections to shady developers who had been paying him under the table. Clarissa slipped flash drives into her purse while Elliot showered, forwarded incriminating emails to Sabrina when he left his laptop open, and even recorded his phone calls when he ranted about burying the competition. Each piece was a thread, and together, the women were weaving a web Elliot couldn't escape. Sabrina kept repeating one phrase. "We don't just want him bruised, we want him finished." And every time, Clarissa nodded with steel in her eyes. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. They began leaking information in small doses, the way poison works best, slowly. First, an anonymous tip to a local journalist about questionable pension withdrawals. Then, a packet of documents mailed to the state attorney's office. Next, a whisper slipped to one of Elliot's business rivals, ensuring paranoia spread through his circle. Elliot noticed. His temper grew shorter, his nights longer, his whiskey glasses heavier. He started locking his office door, snapping at Clarissa when she asked harmless questions, accusing council members of betrayal during meetings. "Everyone's against me," he shouted one night, pacing the living room like a caged animal. Clarissa watched him from the couch, her face calm, her hands folded. She almost felt pity for him, almost. Because what Elliot didn't know was that every outburst, every slip of control, was exactly what she and Sabrina needed. He wasn't just digging his grave anymore. He was throwing himself into it. But the final blow, they decided, needed to be public. Something undeniable, unforgettable. Clarissa suggested the upcoming charity gala. A glamorous event Elliot never missed, where cameras and reporters swarmed like bees. "He'll be in his finest suit, smiling for donors," she said, her lips curling into a smirk. "And that's when we strike." Sabrina loved it. They planned it meticulously. Reporters tipped off to the right evidence, allies ready to ask the right questions, Margot prepared to testify if needed. Clarissa even rehearsed her own role, walking beside Elliot like the dutiful wife until the perfect moment came. The thought made her heart race, but not from fear. For the first time in years, she looked forward to seeing Elliot in the spotlight. Not because of his power, but because she knew it would be the last time he'd ever shine. The net was set. The trap was ready. And when it snapped shut, Elliot would finally know what it felt like to be powerless. The charity gala glittered with chandeliers and champagne flutes, the kind of night where everyone wore masks of elegance while hiding their secrets. Elliot strutted in like he owned the room. His arm linked with Clarissa's as if nothing had changed. He kissed hands, cracked jokes, raised glasses, soaking up every flash of the cameras. But beneath the golden lights, Clarissa's heart thundered, not with fear but anticipation. She spotted Sabrina near the back, disguised as a server, her eyes sharp with focus. At precisely 8 o'clock, the first domino fell. A journalist interrupted Elliot's speech, holding up documents Sabrina had provided. "Councilman Reed," he called out, "how do you explain these pension withdrawals tied to your personal accounts?" Gasps spread like fire. Elliot stammered, his face paling, laughter dying in his throat. For the first time, the king of the room looked like a man cornered. The questions came like bullets. "What about the offshore accounts? Is it true you threatened whistleblowers? How do you explain your ties to illegal contracts?" Elliot's smile cracked, sweat glistening on his forehead as he tried to wave it all away as lies, political games, jealousy. But then Clarissa stepped forward, her voice slicing through the chaos. "They're not lies, Elliot. They're the truth. And you taught me better than anyone. truth always finds its way to light. Gasps turned into whispers, then into roars of shock. Photographers swarmed, flashes blinding him, while Clarissa slipped the microphone from his trembling hand. She handed it to the journalist and stepped aside, watching her husband drown in his own arrogance. At that moment, Sabrina caught her eye from across the room, raising her glass in a silent toast. The net had snapped shut. Elliot tried to fight back, but the harder he clawed, the deeper he sank. Security escorted him out as reporters shouted. Donors pulled away, and allies abandoned him. Clarissa stood tall, no longer his accessory but his undoing. By the time the night ended, Elliot wasn't a powerful councilman. He was a disgraced man on the front page of every paper. As she walked out into the cool night air, Clarissa exhaled, tears burning her eyes, not from sadness but from release. Beside her, Sabrina whispered, "We did it." And for the first time, Clarissa smiled without fear. She had found her voice, her strength, her freedom. Elliot had shut Sabrina out, had tried to silence Clarissa, but in the end, it was their unity that destroyed him. The story of Elliot's fall wasn't just revenge. It was justice. And if you felt the fire of this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of betrayal, revenge, and redemption.